We just got this letter, and if you saw any of the White House press briefing today, it was the White House press corps, many of them, at their absolute worst in the way they approached Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, who was trying to be responsive to medical questions where there were limitations on what she could say. The New York Times reporting of the way the press secretary handled that was to say that she dodged the questions. That is not true. The New York Times is wrong about that. She responded to every one of the questions. She didn't answer the questions with the name that they were asking for of a particular doctor. She didn't give the answer the New York Times wanted or other reporters wanted, but she did, in fact, answer every single time. The reporters kept banging on about a New York Times report today that indicated that a neurologist had visited the White House 8 times in the last year. Here is the full explanation of how that has nothing to do with President Biden and President Biden's health, and that the kind of out-of-control behavior by the White House, most of the White House press corps, not all, most of the White House press corps today, was as bad a circus as it looked like. The president's physician, Kevin O'Connor, has publicly released a memo that is directed to Karine Jean-Pierre, basically in response to what she had to go through today in the White House press briefing. And it explains in more detail something that Karine Jean-Pierre explained today, which is that the White House medical unit does not treat just the president. Many, many White House staffers are treated by the White House medical unit, some cabinet members, and over 1,000 members of the military are serviced in the White House by the White House medical unit, over 1,000 members of the military who serve nearby and in the White House. And so Dr. O'Connor reveals today that in this memo, many military personnel experience neurological issues related to their service. And Dr. Kennard regularly visits the White House medical unit as part of this general neurology practice. The White House physician had already reported that in President Biden's annual physical, he is examined by a neurologist. That's once a year, not 8 times a year, once a year. And that neurologist is that same neurologist, Kevin Kennard. And so elsewhere in the memo, it says Dr. Kennard was the neurological specialist that examined President Biden for each of his annual physicals. His findings have been made public each time I have released the results of the president's annual physical. President Biden has not seen a neurologist outside of his annual physical. And so the White House press corps that wanted to know, wanted the White House today to confirm that this neurologist had visited the White House 8 times. And that's information that is only available to the press corps because the Biden White House reveals the records of every visitor of the White House. How many times did a neurologist visit the Trump White House? The White House press corps has no idea and will never know because the Trump White House never, ever released the White House visitor logs. How many cardiologists visited the White House during Donald Trump's time there? We have no idea because the Trump White House hid all of that information. The only reason the New York Times knows that this doctor was in the White House logs is because the White House, the Biden White House, unlike the Trump White House, makes that information public. The memo goes on to say the results of this year's physical exam by President Biden were detailed in my February 28th letter. And it said this on February 28th about President Biden's physical exam. It says an extremely detailed neurological exam was again reassuring in that there were no findings which would be consistent with any cerebellar or other central neurological disorder such as stroke, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, or ascending lateral sclerosis. Nor are there any signs of cervical myelopathy. This exam did again support a finding of peripheral neuropathy in both feet. No motor weakness was detected. He exhibits no tremor, either at rest or with activity. He demonstrates excellent fine motor dexterity, but a subtle difference in heat-cold sensation could be elicited as it was last year. This heat-cold sensation deficit was detected a couple of inches higher on his ankle calf this year, which is not unexpected. There may, in fact, be day-to-day subjective variation of these findings, as during last year's exam. This area of sensation deficit was actually found to be smaller than the year before. This information that I just read has been public since February 28th. Absolutely no neurological issues whatsoever in the president's physical exam. And now we know that the neurologist who conducted the neurology part of that annual exam was Dr. Kennard, who has, for other purposes, for completely different purposes, visited the White House 8 times, according to the White House visitor logs that are available to the press only because the Biden White House allows those to be made public after the Trump White House banned those from ever being seen by anyone. That's one of the big differences between the presidency of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. One of the smaller differences, one of the least dangerous differences between them, although it is extremely risky, especially in Trump world, not to have any record, no idea who has actually visited the White House. That could actually be a very risky proposition for this country to be living with, a White House where you have no idea who's going in and out. We have other issues to talk about tonight, and we will. But this breaking news about what the New York Times thought today was its giant scandalous scoop that a neurologist had visited the White House 8 times, and that the White House press corps treated as the most important news to hit that room in, I don't know, as long as there has been a Biden presidency, that's for sure. The grotesque behavioral overreaction by the White House press corps today, most, not all, of the White House press corps, was on display on video. It has now been answered in full and completely by Dr. O'Connor, President Biden's physician in the White House. So that controversy's done. Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Representative Joyce Beatty of Ohio. She's also a former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She attended tonight's meeting with President Biden and the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. You've been in the most important political meeting of the day that anyone's been in. What can you tell us about what happened in that discussion with the president tonight?
Well, first of all, Lawrence, thanks for having me on. Yes, we received an invitation from President Biden to meet with the Congressional Black Caucus led by our chair, Stephen Horsford. I thought it was a great meeting. Stephen Horsford asked the president to respond to what his plan, what his vision was. I had the distinct opportunity of introducing the president to the caucus, although he did not need an introduction. He thanked me and all others for being with him and supporting him. He was very clear. He reiterated some of the things that was in the 2-page letter that you've also seen. Unequivocally, he stated that he's running. And I think you have to look at, he was very clear in saying we have a process. He received 14 million of the votes. 87% of those participating in the voting process supported him, some 3,900 delegates. And he went on to talk about how he can beat Donald Trump. And for me, that's the most important thing. We know we saw 4 years of a Trump's leadership, and we know what that did to our freedoms, what it did to our democracy. And now Trump is saying that he wants retribution, he wants revenge, and he lies at every question, every opportunity, versus having a Joe Biden as president who delivers for the American people. We've witnessed what he's done. You can pick a topic. We can talk about health care, which my constituents and others asked about all the time. Putting $35 a month for insulin. We know how many millions and millions of people suffer with diabetes. We could look at the economy. We could look at jobs. 15 million some new jobs that he has created. More money to HBCU. He has also supported Pell Grants in housing and protects our Medicaid and Medicare. So he was very clear that he wants to continue that, and that he clearly is able to beat former President Donald Trump.
Did anyone in the meeting suggest to the president that he should think about stepping down?
We did not have those discussions. It was a discussion for him to make his commitment, outline his future plans, and that we want to be engaged and included with him. It was a very good meeting. It was substantive. He responded well. He was comfortable. He was relaxed, and he was on point. We saw the old Joe Biden. He addressed the issue and said, as he has said openly, that the 90-minute debate, it was a mistake. He didn't do a good job. He was sick. He was tired. He hadn't rested enough. And since then, we've seen him make a comeback. And so he talked about that, and that he would be fully engaged with us and address any questions that we had for him.
What is your confidence level as of tonight in the Biden-Harris ticket?
As you've heard some of our others leaders, Leader Hakeem Jeffries said after the debate and again today, he supports Joe Biden. I fully support Joe Biden to be our nominee for president. I support Vice President Kamala Harris. I think it is a strong ticket. It's the same ticket that people said wouldn't win in 2020, and they not only prevailed and won, they have saved our democracy in this country.
Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, thank you very much for joining us tonight
you.
after that very important meeting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joining our discussion now is Quentin Folks, Principal Deputy Campaign Manager for the Biden-Harris re-election campaign. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I wanted to get your reaction to what Donald Trump just said in the last hour. He was on Fox for 20 minutes of basically ranting about the southern border without a single sentence that I could transcribe and present to you to make any sense. In the middle of it all, there was exactly one line that I could understand and make sense of. Talking about President Biden, Donald Trump said, he's destroying Social Security. That is the only thing that Donald Trump said about Social Security. There wasn't a sentence after that to explain what he meant by what he said there. What is the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden on Social Security?
In this instance, Donald Trump is a liar. We saw him do it on the debate stage. Donald Trump has been hell-bent on gutting Social Security and Medicare since the moment he was elected. He has doubled down on it, and every single time he gets in front of a microphone, he lies and tries to moderate his position on it. But Donald Trump does not care about Social Security. He does not care about seniors. He honestly doesn't care about anyone except himself, which is why he is in this race in the first place, to be a dictator. And the Supreme Court that he largely appointed have just given him the keys to do it. Look at Project 2025. I encourage Americans across the country to look it up. It's terrifying. We should be afraid. He wants to gut checks and balances, get rid of departments like the Department of Education, monitor women's pregnancies, fill cabinet positions with Trump loyalists who are going to continue to take away people's rights and freedoms. Americans should look at it. It was written for Trump by people closest to him. He is trying to distance himself from it, but this is Donald Trump's platform. It is extreme and it is dangerous.
We saw President Biden out there on the road this weekend while Donald Trump was, as President Biden said, doing absolutely nothing. How much campaigning are you going to be able to mix into what's coming now with the NATO summit?
Look, the president is committed to continuing to communicate directly to American voters so that they can see him in their communities where it matters most. You heard the president this morning on Morning Joe talk about what he did. We did these events because the president wanted to go out and hear directly from voters. You heard clips earlier in the show from Congressman Horsford, Leader Jeffries, talking about what they did. They spent time in their districts listening to voters because voters pick presidents, and the voters have overwhelmingly said that Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee. You just heard Congresswoman Beatty lay out the fact that President Biden got 87% of the 14 million votes cast. He holds 3,900 delegates, an overwhelming majority. That is what President Biden is committed to doing, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to get the president in front of as many people as possible to lay out the stakes of this election, which are quite simply, President Biden wakes up every single day fighting for the American people. Donald Trump is only in this campaign for revenge, retribution, and continuing to excite political extremism across this country.
So far, I believe there's 9 Democratic members of the House, approximately, who have said President Biden should step down as the nominee, serve out his term, and help create another ticket. That's, of course, that's less than 5% of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. But there are 2 senators. I want to read you 2 senators' statements, Democratic senators, because they are both highly influential senators. And one is Elizabeth Warren. This is the one you're going to like. She told the Boston Globe tonight, President Biden is our nominee. He is an excellent president. He works hard on behalf of working families every day. That's Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking to the Boston Globe. Senator Patty Murray says something different. She says, I have a deep appreciation and a strong respect for Joe, who has led a historic first term as president. Still, we need to see a much more forceful and energetic candidate on the campaign trail in the very near future in order for him to convince voters he is up to the job. I believe President Biden must do more to demonstrate he can campaign strong enough to beat Donald Trump. Do you take that that statement from Patty Murray basically as your kind of strategic campaign marching orders at this point?
I take it as a continuation of everything that we have been doing. The president has been out and about. It is going to be a continuation of a robust travel schedule across the country into our battleground states, communicating with voters directly where they are. We're going to continue opening field offices, almost at 300 now. We're going to continue hiring staff in battleground states. We're going to continue to build a volunteer base to take the message directly to American voters. The president has been out. We just saw him in Philadelphia. He was at a church. He was in Madison, Wisconsin, did a rally. The president has been meeting with congressional leaders, talking about what's at stake in this election and the work that they must continue to do. All of these people who are, giving recommendations and talking about what the president should and shouldn't do, they are patriots. They care about their country. They were involved in passing a lot of the legislation that President Biden has signed into law, and under his leadership have delivered real things for the American people. So all of this comes from a place of goodwill. And we take it as a sign that we now need to come together as a Democratic Party to defeat Donald Trump, because he is extreme, dangerous, out of touch from the American people. But the voters have spoken. President Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee. Our campaign has earned that, and we're going to continue to build on what we have to this point to make sure we're communicating our message to American voters directly.
So the Biden-Harris campaign owns the Democratic convention. In addition to running this presidential campaign and moving your candidates around, you also have to be planning the Democratic convention, the lineup of speakers, everything, entertainment, everything. Is that planning for a Biden-Harris convention going ahead as it normally would be at this time?
Never stopped at all. Joe Biden is the nominee. We've known it since we wrapped up the Democratic primary process with force. Voters overwhelmingly spoke. We're excited about hosting a convention in Chicago. We look forward to telling the story of President Biden and Vice President Harris and the second-term vision that they have for this country.
Quentin Fowlkes, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.